Nina thought it was just another tough day at the hospital, but when Dr. Whitmore publicly embarrassed her in front of a patient, things took a shocking turn. Little did the doctor know, the elderly man quietly observing his cruelty wasn't just any patient, and his true identity would change everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching or listening from, what city or country. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. Nina Johnson could feel the weight of Dr. Whitmore's gaze as she tightened the tourniquet around Mr. Bennett's arm, bracing herself for another verbal attack. The fluorescent lights of Trinity Memorial Hospital's recovery ward cast harsh shadows across the elderly patient's face, accentuating the worry lines etched deep into his skin. "Nurse Johnson, are you quite finished fumbling with that tourniquet?" Dr. Whitmore's voice cut through the air, sharp as a scalpel. "Some of us have actual medical procedures to perform today." Nina took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Just ensuring Mr. Bennett's comfort, doctor. I'll be done in a moment." Mr. Bennett's eyes flickered between Nina and Dr. Whitmore, a frown creasing his brow. "The nurse is doing a fine job, doctor. No need to rush her." Dr. Whitmore's lips thinned into a tight line. "Mr. Bennett, I assure you that I know what constitutes proper care in this hospital. Nurse Johnson is new here and still learning our standards." Nina bit back a retort. She'd been a registered nurse for 5 years, with glowing recommendations from her previous hospital. But here at Trinity Memorial, it seemed her experience counted for nothing. As she finished securing the tourniquet, Nina noticed Mr. Bennett studying her closely. There was something in his gaze, a sharpness that belied his frail appearance. "Thank you, Nurse Johnson," he said softly. "Your touch is much gentler than some I've experienced here." Nina offered him a small smile. "Just doing my job, Mr. Bennett. Let me know if you need anything else." As she turned to leave, Dr. Whitmore blocked her path. A word, "Nurse Johnson." He jerked his head toward the hallway, not waiting for her response before striding out. Nina followed, her stomach nodding. She'd been at Trinity Memorial for less than a week, and already she felt like she was walking on eggshells. In the hallway, Dr. Whitmore rounded on her. "I don't know what kind of slack operation you came from, Nurse Johnson, but here at Trinity Memorial, we have standards. Your dithering in there was unprofessional and time-wasting." Nina straightened her spine. "With all due respect, Dr. Whitmore, I was following proper procedure for." "Don't presume to lecture me on proper procedure," he snapped. "I've been practicing medicine since before you were born. Now, I suggest you shape up quickly, or you might find your tenure here at Trinity Memorial to be very short indeed." As Dr. Whitmore stalked away, Nina leaned against the wall, letting out a shaky breath. She thought of her mother, who had marched for civil rights and faced down water cannons and police dogs. "Stay strong, baby," her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You're carrying our history on your shoulders. Don't let them see you bend." Nina squared her shoulders and headed back to the nurse's station. She wouldn't let Dr. Whitmore or anyone else break her spirit. At the station, she found her colleague, Sarah, sorting through patient charts. "Rough morning?" Sarah asked, eyeing Nina's tense expression. "Dr. Whitmore again," Nina replied, keeping her voice low. "I swear, that man has it out for me." Sarah glanced around before leaning in. "Look, Nina, I know it's not fair, but Dr. Whitmore's got a lot of pull here. Maybe try not to, stand out so much." Nina's eyebrows shot up. "Stand out? What exactly do you mean by that, Sarah?" Sarah fidgeted uncomfortably. Just try to blend in more. Don't rock the boat." "Blend in," Nina repeated, her voice tight. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that?" Before Sarah could respond, a commotion from Mr. Bennett's room drew their attention. Nina rushed in to find the elderly man struggling to sit up, his face contorted in pain. "Mr. Bennett, what's wrong?" Nina asked, quickly moving to his side. "My chest," he gasped. "Feels like... can't breathe." Nina's training kicked in. She checked his vitals, noting his elevated heart rate and dropping oxygen levels. "Sarah, page Dr. Whitmore's stat," she called out, "and bring the crash cart." As Sarah hurried off, Nina focused on Mr. Bennett. "Just try to relax, sir. We're going to take care of you." Dr. Whitmore burst into the room moments later. "What's the situation?" Nina rattled off Mr. Bennett's symptoms and vitals. "I suspect a pulmonary embolism, doctor. We should start him on heparin immediately, and—" "I'll make the diagnosis here, Nurse Johnson." Dr. Whitmore cut her off. He turned to Mr. Bennett, his tone softening. "Now, Mr. Bennett, I'm sure it's nothing serious. Probably just some post-operative discomfort. We'll give you something for the pain." Nina's eyes widened. "But doctor, his symptoms clearly indicate—" "That's enough," Dr. Whitmore snapped. "You're overreacting and alarming the patient unnecessarily. I won't have it." Mr. Bennett's labored breathing filled the tense silence. His eyes darted between Nina and Dr. Whitmore, confusion and fear evident in his gaze. Nina made a split-second decision. She knew the risks, to the patient if she was wrong, to her career if she was right but overstepped. But she couldn't stand by and watch a man suffer. "Mr. Bennett," she said firmly, "I believe you're experiencing a pulmonary embolism. It's a blood clot in your lung, and it's very serious. We need to start treatment immediately." Dr. Whitmore's face flushed with anger. "Nurse Johnson, you are way out of line. I'm ordering you to—" "Do it," Mr. Bennett wheezed, his eyes locked on Nina. "Trust the nurse." For a moment, Dr. Whitmore seemed to war with himself. Then, his professional instincts overrode his pride. "Fine. Start the heparin drip. But this isn't over, Nurse Johnson." As they worked to stabilize Mr. Bennett, Nina could feel the weight of what she'd done settling on her shoulders. She'd saved a patient's life, but at what cost to her future at Trinity Memorial? Hours later, after Mr. Bennett had been moved to the ICU and stabilized, Nina found herself called into the Chief of Medicine's office. Dr. Whitmore was already there, a smug look on his face. "Nurse Johnson," the chief began, his expression grave. "Dr. Whitmore has brought some serious concerns to my attention regarding your conduct today." Nina's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Sir, I was acting in the best interest of the patient. Mr. Bennett was exhibiting clear signs of a pulmonary embolism, and immediate action was necessary." "Be that as it may," the chief continued, "we have protocols here at Trinity Memorial. Nurses do not contradict attending physicians in front of patients. It undermines our entire system." "With all due respect, sir," Nina countered, "those protocols shouldn't come at the expense of patient care. Mr. Bennett could have died if we delayed treatment." Dr. Whitmore scoffed. "You're being melodramatic, Nurse Johnson. I had the situation well in hand." The chief held up a hand to silence them both. "Regardless of the outcome, Nurse Johnson, your actions today were insubordinate. I'm placing a formal reprimand in your file. Any further incidents like this, and we'll have to reconsider your position here at Trinity Memorial." Nina felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She'd known there would be consequences, but this felt like the beginning of the end. As she left the office, Dr. Whitmore's voice followed her. "I told you to shape up, Nurse Johnson. Perhaps now you'll learn your place." Nina's hands clenched into fists as she walked away. She thought of her mother again, of all the struggles she'd faced and overcome. This was just another battle in a long war. She wouldn't give up, not when patients like Mr. Bennett were counting on her. Speaking of Mr. Bennett, Nina realized it was time for his evening check. As she approached his room in the ICU, she overheard voices from inside. "Can't believe the way they treated that nurse," Mr. Bennett was saying. "She saved my life, and they're punishing her for it." "Now, Mr. Bennett," came another voice, one of the hospital board members. Nina realized with a start. "I'm sure there's more to the story then." "There's nothing more to it," Mr. Bennett cut in, his voice stronger than Nina had ever heard it. "That young woman showed more medical knowledge and integrity in 5 minutes than that blowhard doctor did in 2 days. And if this is how Trinity Memorial treats its best staff, well, I might have to reconsider a few things." Nina's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? And why was a board member in Mr. Bennett's room so late? Before she could ponder it further, the door opened, and the board member nearly collided with her. He gave her a strange look, part surprise, part calculation, before hurrying away. Nina entered the room to find Mr. Bennet looking more alert than she'd seen him since his admission. He smiled when he saw her. "Ah, Nurse Johnson, just the person I wanted to see." "How are you feeling, Mr. Bennet?" Nina asked, checking his vitals. "Much better, thanks to you." He paused, studying her face. "You look troubled, my dear. I hope you're not facing any difficulties because of what happened earlier." Nina hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's nothing I can't handle, Mr. Bennet. I'm just glad you're doing better." Mr. Bennet's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "Well, Nurse Johnson, I have a feeling things around here might be changing soon. You just keep doing what you're doing. Sometimes the people who seem to have the least power are the ones who end up changing everything." As Nina left Mr. Bennet's room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was brewing. Whatever it was, she'd face it head-on, just like her mother had taught her. In a world that often seemed determined to push her down, Nina Johnson would stand tall, armed with compassion, skill, and an unshakable belief in doing what was right. Little did she know, the winds of change were already beginning to blow through the halls of Trinity Memorial Hospital. And at the center of that storm was a quiet, elderly patient named George Bennet, a man with far more influence than anyone had realized. Nina's fingers trembled as she adjusted Mr. Bennet's drip, hyper-aware of Dr. Whitmore's scrutinizing gaze boring into her back. The weight of the formal reprimand in her file hung heavy, a constant reminder of the precarious nature of her position at Trinity Memorial. "Nurse Johnson," Dr. Whitmore's voice cut through the air like a whip. "I trust you're not planning any more unauthorized treatments today." Nina took a steadying breath before turning to face him. "No, Dr. Whitmore, just following the prescribed care plan." Mr. Bennet's eyes darted between them, a frown creasing his weathered face. "Is there a problem, doctor?" "Not at all, Mr. Bennet," Dr. Whitmore replied, his tone suddenly saccharine. "I'm simply ensuring that Nurse Johnson understands her role here." As Dr. Whitmore swept out of the room, Nina felt a gentle touch on her arm. Mr. Bennet looked up at her, his eyes kind but searching. "Don't let him get to you, my dear. Men like that, they're all bluster and no substance." Nina managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Mr. Bennet. I appreciate your kindness." As she left the room, Nina couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Bennet was more than just a sympathetic patient. There was something in his gaze, a sharpness that belied his frail appearance. At the nurse's station, Sarah approached Nina cautiously. "Hey, Nina, I heard about what happened with Dr. Whitmore. Are you okay?" Nina's jaw clenched. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just doing my job." Sarah glanced around before leaning in closer. "Look, I know it's not fair, but maybe you should try to keep your head down for a while. Dr. Whitmore has a lot of influence here, and—" "And what?" Nina interrupted, her voice low but intense. "I should just let him treat me like I'm incompetent, ignore it when patients' lives are at risk." Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide. "I'm just trying to help, Nina. You're new here, and—" "I may be new," Nina cut in, "but I'm a damn good nurse. And I won't compromise my integrity or my patient's care just to make Dr. Whitmore feel better about himself." As Sarah hurried away, Nina felt a pang of regret. She knew Sarah meant well, but the constant pressure was wearing her down. She thought of her mother, of the stories she'd told about facing down fire hoses and police dogs during the civil rights movement. "Stay strong, baby," her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Our strength is in our dignity." The day wore on, each hour bringing a new challenge. Dr. Whitmore seemed to materialize at every turn, questioning Nina's every decision, no matter how routine. By mid-afternoon, the stress had taken its toll. As Nina reached for a vial of medication, her hand knocked over a tray of instruments, sending them clattering to the floor. Well, Dr. Whitmore's voice dripped with disdain. "It seems Nurse Johnson can't even manage basic tasks without making a mess. Perhaps you'd be better suited to janitorial work." Nina's cheeks burned as she knelt to clean up the spilled instruments. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Mr. Bennet watching from his doorway, his expression unreadable. As the day drew to a close, Nina found herself back in Mr. Bennet's room, checking his vitals one last time before her shift ended. "You look tired, Nurse Johnson," Mr. Bennet observed. "These long days can be grueling, can't they?" Nina nodded, forcing a smile. "Nothing I can't handle, Mr. Bennet. How are you feeling?" Before he could answer, Dr. Whitmore burst into the room, waving a chart. "Nurse Johnson, can you explain why Mr. Bennet hasn't received his evening dose of anticoagulants?" Nina frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, doctor, but that's not on his current medication schedule. In fact, given his latest blood work, I was going to suggest we—" "Are you questioning my orders?" Dr. Whitmore's face flushed red. "I made it very clear this morning that Mr. Bennet was to start on a new regimen. Your incompetence could have serious consequences." Nina's heart raced. She was certain there had been no such order, but doubt crept in. Had she missed something? Made a mistake that could harm a patient? Mr. Bennet's voice cut through the tension. "I don't recall any discussion about new medication, doctor. In fact, Nurse Johnson has been quite diligent in explaining every aspect of my care." Dr. Whitmore's expression flickered between anger and uncertainty. "Well, Mr. Bennet, sometimes these things can be confusing for patients. I assure you, the order was given." "Was it now?" Mr. Bennet's tone sharpened. "I may be old, doctor, but my mind is as sharp as ever, and I don't appreciate being spoken to as if I'm senile." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Nina glanced between Mr. Bennet and Dr. Whitmore, sensing a shift in the air she couldn't quite define. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Well, perhaps there was some miscommunication. I'll review the charts again. Nurse Johnson, see me in my office before you leave." As Dr. Whitmore left, Nina felt a wave of dread wash over her. She turned to Mr. Bennet, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for speaking up, Mr. Bennet. I'm sorry you had to witness that." Mr. Bennet's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "Don't you worry about me, my dear. I've seen my fair share of bullies in my time. They all fall eventually." Nina left Mr. Bennet's room with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. There was definitely more to this patient than met the eye, but she had bigger problems to deal with. In Dr. Whitmore's office, the tension was palpable. He paced behind his desk, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Nurse Johnson, your continued insubordination is becoming a serious problem. You consistently question my authority, undermine my decisions, and now you've managed to turn a patient against me." Nina's hands clenched at her sides. "Dr. Whitmore, I have done nothing but provide the best possible care for my patients. If that means speaking up when I see a potential issue, then yes, I will continue to do so." Dr. Whitmore slammed his hand on the desk. "You are walking a very thin line, Nurse Johnson. One more misstep, and I'll make sure you never work in this hospital again. Do I make myself clear?" Nina stood her ground, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Crystal clear, doctor. Is there anything else?" As she turned to leave, Dr. Whitmore's voice stopped her. "Oh, and Nurse Johnson, I'll be taking over Mr. Bennet's care personally from now on. Your office case." Nina left the office, her mind reeling. She'd known working at Trinity Memorial would be challenging, but this felt like more than just the usual new job jitters. There was a systemic problem here, a culture of bias and intimidation that went beyond one difficult doctor. As she gathered her things to leave, Nina overheard hushed voices coming from a nearby conference room. Curiosity got the better of her, and she edged closer to the partially open door. "Can't believe we didn't know," a woman's voice hissed. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for the hospital?" "Calm down, Margaret," a man replied. "We don't know for certain that he's unhappy with his care. Maybe if we what, John?" The woman cut in. "Offer him a private suite, a personal chef. He's George Bennet, for God's sake, CEO of MedX Innovations. If he decides to pull his support." Nina's breath caught in her throat. George Bennet, the frail, kind old man she'd been caring for, was the head of one of the largest healthcare technology companies in the country? Before she could process this revelation, A hand gripped her arm, spinning her around. Dr. Whitmore's face loomed close, his eyes blazing with fury. "Eavesdropping now, Nurse Johnson. I knew you were trouble, but I never pegged you for a spy." Nina wrenched her arm free. "I wasn't spying, Dr. Whitmore. I was just—" "Save it," he snarled. "I've had enough of your excuses. Report to HR first thing tomorrow morning. Your time at Trinity Memorial is over." As Dr. Whitmore stormed off, Nina leaned against the wall, her world spinning. She'd lost her job, her reputation was in tatters, and she'd uncovered a secret that could shake the entire hospital to its core. In that moment, Nina Johnson faced a choice. She could walk away, find another job, and leave Trinity Memorial's problems behind. Or she could stand her ground, fight for what was right, and potentially change the system from within. As she made her way to the exit, Nina passed Mr. Bennett's room one last time. He caught her eye, offering a small, knowing smile. In that moment, Nina knew what she had to do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Nina Johnson was ready to face them head-on. After all, she was her mother's daughter, and giving up had never been in their family's vocabulary. Nina's hands trembled as she smoothed her uniform, steeling herself for the meeting with HR. The sterile hallways of Trinity Memorial seemed to close in around her, each step echoing her uncertain future. As she approached the HR office, a harried-looking assistant intercepted her. "Nurse Johnson, the board requests your presence in the main conference room immediately." Nina's heart leapt into her throat. "The board, but I was told to report to HR." "Plans have changed." The assistant cut her off, already hurrying away. "Conference room, now." Confusion and dread warred within Nina as she made her way to the conference room. She'd expected to be quietly dismissed, not summoned before the hospital's leadership. As she entered, the tension in the air was palpable. The board members sat in stony silence, their faces a mix of concern and barely concealed anger. Dr. Whitmore stood at the far end, his usual smug expression replaced by one of barely contained fury. "Nurse Johnson," the board chairman began, his voice clipped. "We've called you here to address some concerning allegations regarding your conduct and that of certain members of our staff." Nina's mind raced. Had they discovered her eavesdropping? Was this about Mr. Bennett? Before she could respond, the door burst open. George Bennett strode in, looking far more commanding than his frail hospital gown suggested. "I believe I can shed some light on those allegations," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Dr. Whitmore's face drained of color. "Mr. Bennett," the chairman sputtered, "we weren't expecting. I mean, you should be resting." "I've rested quite enough, thank you," Bennett cut him off. "And I've seen quite enough as well." He turned to Nina, his eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and determination. "Nurse Johnson, I believe you have some thoughts on how this hospital could improve its patient care and staff relations." Nina blinked, momentarily stunned. Then, drawing on a well of strength she didn't know she possessed, she straightened her spine and addressed the board. "Yes, I do," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "For weeks, I've witnessed and experienced a culture of discrimination and intimidation that not only demoralizes staff, but puts patient care at risk." Dr. Whitmore's face contorted with rage. "This is preposterous. Mr. Chairman, I won't stand here and be slandered by a what, Dr. Whitmore?" Bennett's voice cut through the air like a whip. A highly qualified nurse who had the courage to stand up for her patients and her principles? Or were you going to say something else? The room fell silent, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. Nina pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "I've seen talented nurses of color overlooked for promotions. I've watched as concerns about patient care were dismissed based on who raised them, not their merit. And I've experienced firsthand the consequences of challenging this toxic system." She turned to Dr. Whitmore, meeting his glare head-on. "Dr. Whitmore, you've made it clear from day one that you don't believe I belong here. You've questioned my competence, undermined my authority, and created a hostile work environment not just for me, but for anyone who doesn't fit your narrow view of what a healthcare professional should look like." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman cleared his throat. "These are serious allegations, Nurse Johnson. Do you have any evidence to support them?" "I do," Bennett interjected, producing a small recording device. "I may be old, but I'm not deaf. I've recorded numerous instances of discriminatory behavior, unsafe medical practices, and attempts to cover up mistakes. Would you care to hear them, Dr. Whitmore?" Dr. Whitmore's face had gone from red to ashen. This is a violation of privacy. You can't." "Oh, I think you'll find I can," Bennett replied coolly, "especially when patient safety is at stake." He turned to the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, I came to Trinity Memorial not just as a patient, but as the CEO of MedX Innovations. We were considering a substantial partnership with your hospital, but after witnessing the treatment of Nurse Johnson and others, I'm afraid that partnership is now off the table." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Board members gasped. Dr. Whitmore looked ready to faint, and Nina felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Bennett continued, his voice hard. "However, I'm willing to reconsider, on one condition. Nurse Johnson is given the authority to implement a comprehensive overhaul of your staff training, hiring practices, and patient care protocols, with full board support and no interference from those who've perpetuated this toxic culture." His gaze bore into Dr. Whitmore. The chairman sputtered, "Mr. Bennett, surely we can discuss this privately." "There will be no more hiding, no more sweeping things under the rug," Bennett declared. "It's time for Trinity Memorial to step into the light and become the institution it claims to be." Nina's mind reeled. Just moments ago, she'd been facing unemployment. Now, she was being offered the chance to reshape the entire hospital culture. Dr. Whitmore, seeing his power slipping away, made a last desperate attempt. "This is absurd. You can't possibly entrust such responsibility to someone so." "So what, Dr. Whitmore?" Nina's voice was quiet but firm. "So black, so female, or so committed to actually putting patients first." The room fell silent. The weight of years of unspoken bias and discrimination finally laid bare. Nina took a deep breath, channeling the strength of her mother and all those who had fought for equality before her. "I didn't come to Trinity Memorial to start a revolution. I came to be a nurse, to heal, to comfort, to save lives. But if changing this system is what it takes to do that job properly, then that's exactly what I'll do." She turned to the board, her gaze unwavering. "I have ideas for new training programs, for creating support systems for minority staff, for implementing anonymous reporting systems for discriminatory behavior. I want to establish mentorship programs, diversity in hiring panels, and regular reviews of patient outcomes across all demographics." The chairman nodded slowly, a mix of respect and resignation in his eyes. "It seems we have a lot of work to do, Nurse Johnson. Mr. Bennett, if you're willing to give us this chance, I assure you the board will provide its full support." Bennett smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "I'm glad to hear it. Nurse Johnson, are you ready to take on this challenge?" Nina looked around the room, at the shocked board members, the seething Dr. Whitmore, and the encouraging Mr. Bennett. She thought of all the nurses and patients who had suffered under the old system, of her mother's fights for equality, of her own struggles and triumphs. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I'm ready." As the meeting adjourned, Nina felt a mix of exhilaration and trepidation. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and setbacks. But for the first time since she'd arrived at Trinity Memorial, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for every patient and healthcare worker who had been marginalized or silenced. Dr. Whitmore stormed out, muttering about lawyers and contracts. The board members filed out, some looking shell-shocked, others already pulling out phones to start damage control. Bennett approached Nina, his eyes twinkling. "Well, Nurse Johnson, it seems you've started quite the revolution after all." Nina shook her head, still processing the whirlwind of events. "Mr. Bennett, I can't thank you enough. But why me? Why go to all this trouble?" Bennett's expression softened. "Because, my dear, in all my years in healthcare, I've learned one crucial thing. It's not the technology or the fancy equipment that saves lives. It's people like you. People with compassion, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. You reminded an old man what real healthcare should look like. As they walked out of the conference room together, Nina felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. But alongside it was a fierce determination. She thought of her mother's words. Change doesn't come easy, baby, but comes to those who stand tall and never back down. Nina Johnson stood tall, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had fought for her place at Trinity Memorial, and now she would fight to make it a place where everyone, regardless of their color, gender, or background, could heal and be healed. The halls of Trinity Memorial buzzed with the news of the board meeting's outcome. As Nina made her way through the hospital, she caught snippets of conversation, saw the mix of hope and apprehension on her colleagues' faces. Sarah, the nurse who had once advised Nina to keep her head down, approached hesitantly. Nina, I heard what happened. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you before. I was scared, but that's no excuse. Nina regarded her former colleague, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. Fear can make us complicit, Sarah, but it's never too late to choose courage. Are you ready to be part of the change? Sarah nodded, a determined glint in her eye. Yes, I am. As word spread, other staff members approached Nina, some to offer congratulations, others to voice concerns or share their own experiences of discrimination. With each conversation, Nina felt the enormity of the task ahead, but also the growing swell of support. By the end of the day, Nina found herself back in Mr. Bennett's room, checking his vitals one last time before his discharge. Well, Nurse Johnson, he said with a smile, it seems you've had quite a day. Are you ready for what comes next? Nina met his gaze, her voice steady. It won't be easy, Mr. Bennett. There's so much to change, so many ingrained behaviors to address. But yes, I'm ready, because it's not just about me anymore. It's about every patient who deserves the best care, regardless of who they are. It's about every healthcare worker who deserves respect and equal opportunity. Bennett nodded approvingly. That's the spirit, my dear. Remember, true change isn't just about policies and procedures. It's about changing hearts and minds. And that, Nurse Johnson, is a battle you've already begun to win. As Nina left Mr. Bennett's room, she paused in the hallway, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of the hospital. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as she stood there, Nina Johnson felt a surge of determination. She was no longer just a nurse fighting for her place in a biased system. She was a catalyst for change, a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope in a place that desperately needed it. And she was ready to transform Trinity Memorial into the hospital it was always meant to be. One patient, one policy, one heart at a time. Nina stood at the podium, her heart pounding as she faced the packed auditorium. The entire staff of Trinity Memorial Hospital sat before her, a sea of expectant faces ranging from hopeful to skeptical. At the back, she spotted Mr. Bennett, offering an encouraging nod. Thank you all for coming, Nina began, her voice steady despite her nerves. We're here today because Trinity Memorial stands at a crossroads. We can continue down the path we've been on, a path of discrimination, fear, and compromised patient care. Or we can choose a new direction. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. I've experienced firsthand the toxic culture that's taken root here. I've been belittled, undermined, and pushed to the brink of quitting. But I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about us, all of us, and the patients we serve. As Nina outlined her vision for change, she could feel the energy in the room shift. Some leaned forward, nodding in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. We need a complete overhaul of our hiring practices, Nina continued. Diverse hiring panels, blind resume reviews, and a mentorship program for underrepresented staff. But more than that, we need to change our culture. No more turning a blind eye to discrimination. No more valuing ego over patient care. From the corner of her eye, Nina saw Dr. Whitmore enter the auditorium, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He took a seat in the back, arms crossed. "I know change is scary," Nina acknowledged. "It means admitting we've been part of the problem, but it also means being part of the solution. Every person in this room has the power to make Trinity Memorial a place where all staff are respected and all patients receive the best possible care." As Nina wrapped up her presentation, the room erupted in applause. Not everyone was clapping, but the support was overwhelming. She stepped down from the podium, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Mr. Bennett approached, beaming. "Well done, Nurse Johnson. You've lit the spark. Now comes the hard part, fanning it into a flame." Before Nina could respond, Dr. Whitmore pushed his way through the crowd. "This is preposterous," he snarled. "You can't possibly think this. This nurse is qualified to overhaul hospital policy." The room fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Nina squared her shoulders. "Dr. Whitmore, this isn't about qualifications. It's about recognizing a problem and having the courage to address it." "Problem?" Whitmore scoffed. "The only problem here is your inability to follow orders and respect authority." "Respect is earned, Dr. Whitmore," Nina replied calmly. "And it's earned through actions, not titles." Whitmore's face flushed red. "You uppity little." "That's quite enough, Dr. Whitmore." Mr. Bennett's voice cut through the tension. "I believe you've made your position clear, as has Nurse Johnson." Whitmore turned to Bennett, sneering. "And who are you to interfere? Just because you've got money doesn't mean you understand how a hospital works." A hush fell over the room. Bennett's eyes narrowed. "I understand more than you think, Doctor. I understand that a hospital is meant to heal, not harm, to uplift, not oppress. And I understand that your time at Trinity Memorial is over." Whitmore blanched. "You can't fire me. I'm tenured. I'll sue." "By all means, sue," Bennett replied coolly. "I'm sure the board would love to air all of this in open court. Your discriminatory practices, your attempts to cover up medical errors, your blatant disregard for patient safety. Sue us, Dr. Whitmore. I dare you." As security escorted a sputtering Whitmore from the auditorium, Nina felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But she knew this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Trinity Memorial underwent a transformation. Nina worked tirelessly, implementing new training programs, revising hiring practices, and creating support systems for minority staff. It wasn't easy. There was pushback, resistance to change, and moments of doubt. But slowly, surely, the culture began to shift. Nina saw it in the small moments. A senior doctor asking a junior nurse of color for their opinion, a patient from a marginalized community receiving more attentive care, staff members calling out microaggressions instead of letting them slide. 1 month after her presentation, Nina found herself in a board meeting presenting the preliminary results of her initiatives. "Patient satisfaction scores are up 15%, she reported. "Staff retention has improved, especially among minority employees. And we've seen a 20% decrease in reported incidents of discrimination or harassment." The board members nodded approvingly, but Nina wasn't finished. "However, we still have a long way to go. These changes need to be more than just policies on paper. They need to become part of our DNA as an institution." As the meeting adjourned, Mr. Bennett pulled Nina aside. "Walk with me, Nurse Johnson. There's something I need to discuss with you." They strolled through the hospital corridors, Nina marveling at the subtle but significant changes she could see around her. "You've done remarkable work here," Bennett began. "More than I could have hoped for, which is why what I'm about to tell you is so difficult." Nina's heart sank. "What is it, Mr. Bennett?" He sighed heavily. "MedX Innovations, my company, was planning a major partnership with Trinity Memorial. A state-of-the-art wing, cutting-edge technology, the works. But after witnessing the systemic issues here, even with the progress you've made, I can't, in good conscience, move forward with that partnership." Nina felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. But we're changing. We're getting better." Bennett held up a hand. "You are. And that's commendable. But the rot ran deep, Nurse Johnson. Deeper than even I realized. The board's initial reluctance to address these issues, the years of turning a blind eye, It's made me question whether Trinity Memorial is the right fit for what we're trying to achieve." Nina's mind raced. All the work they'd done, all the progress they'd made, was it all for nothing? "However," Bennett continued, a glimmer in his eye, "I have an alternative proposition, one that I think you'll find intriguing." He outlined his plan, a new medical center built from the ground up with equality, diversity, and patient-centered care at its core. State-of-the-art facilities combined with a revolutionary approach to staffing and patient care. "And I want you to be a part of it, Nurse Johnson," Bennett finished. "Not just as a nurse, but as a key member of a leadership team. Your experience, your vision, they're exactly what we need." Nina's head spun. It was an incredible opportunity, a chance to create real, lasting change on a scale she'd never imagined. "But what about Trinity Memorial?" she asked. "All the people here who've started to believe in change." Bennett smiled softly. "The seeds you've planted here will continue to grow, with or without you. But think of how many more seeds you could plant, how many more lives you could touch, with the resources and freedom this new venture would provide." As they reached the hospital entrance, Nina paused, looking back at the building that had been the site of so much struggle and triumph. Bennett placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to decide right now. Take some time to think it over." Nina nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. As Bennett turned to leave, she called out, "Mr. Bennett?" He looked back, eyebrows raised. "Thank you," Nina said softly. "Not just for this opportunity, but for believing in me when no one else did." Bennett's eyes crinkled with warmth. "Sometimes, Nurse Johnson, the best medicine isn't what you give to the patient, but what you leave behind. And you, my dear, have left behind a legacy of courage, compassion, and change. Whatever you decide, never forget that." As Bennett walked away, Nina stood at the entrance of Trinity Memorial, caught between the familiar world behind her and the unknown possibilities ahead. She thought of her mother, of the battles she had fought for equality. She thought of Dr. Whitmore, of the systemic racism she'd confronted head-on. She thought of all the patients and colleagues whose lives she'd touched. Whatever path she chose, Nina knew one thing for certain. She would continue to fight for justice, to advocate for those without a voice, and to bring compassion and equality to healthcare. Whether at Trinity Memorial or in a brand new facility, her journey was far from over. Nina took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward into her future, a future she had fought for, a future she had earned, a future where healing wasn't just about mending bodies, but about mending the very fabric of society itself. As she walked away from Trinity Memorial, Nina felt a profound sense of transformation. She had arrived as a nurse fighting for her place in a biased system. She was leaving as a leader, a change maker, a beacon of hope for countless others who would follow in her footsteps. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds. Nina paused, turning to look back one last time at the building that had been the crucible of her transformation. In that moment, she made her decision. She would take Mr. Bennett's offer, not because it was easier or more prestigious, but because it offered the chance to build something truly revolutionary from the ground up, a place where the values of equality, compassion, and excellence weren't just buzzwords, but the very foundation of everything they did. As for Trinity Memorial, she would ensure that her work there wasn't in vain. She'd train her replacement, establish mentorship programs, and create a transition plan to keep the momentum of change going. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. Nina pulled out her phone and dialed Mr. Bennett's number. When he answered, her voice was clear and confident. "Mr. Bennett, I'm in. Let's change healthcare for the better. One patient, one nurse, one doctor at a time." As she hung up, Nina felt a surge of excitement and purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But she was ready to face whatever came her way, armed with the strength of her convictions and the power of her compassion. Nina Johnson, once a nurse fighting against a tide of discrimination, was now a pioneer charting a course for a more just and equitable future in healthcare. And as she walked away from Trinity Memorial for the last time, she carried with her not just the lessons of her struggles, but the hope and determination to create a world where every patient, every healthcare worker could be seen, heard, and valued. The best medicine, indeed, was what she would leave behind, a legacy of courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to change. And that medicine would continue to heal long after she had gone, touching lives in ways she could only begin to imagine.